Thank you to those of you who have stuck around with me. Yes, my talk will be in English. I apologize, my French is not good enough. Tonight I'll be speaking, as Jean-Jacques introduced me, about the vegetal diet of Pleistocene hominins. Though I have to confess, it's very hard to stick just to the vegetable side of things, so I will be discussing a bit more about the entirety of the diet, and also speaking about a wider variety of hominins than those that just lived in the Pleistocene, including some older species. I propose to you that humans, as a species, have been extremely successful. We have colonized every continent. There is hardly a habitat or an environment in which we do not live and thrive. Our population has surpassed 7 billion. I think, and I hope to convince you tonight, that our diet has contributed to this success. We know that diet is fundamental to a species, that diet is linked to the morphology of the species. Even Darwin noticed this among the birds that he studied on the Galapagos Islands, that though the birds were closely related, they had extremely variable morphology that was a direct result of the particular foods that they could access. We also know that diet is intimately linked with social behavior. Among primates, for example, those that focus on leaves have larger group sizes in general than those that focus on fruits. We use technology and certain cultural ways of using that technology in order to access foods, and this can be seen not only in humans, but also in chimpanzees and in fact in crows as well. And finally, and perhaps obviously, diet is linked with the health of individuals and with the species in general. The food that you consume, whether it's too much or too little, can have a direct impact on your survival and your ability to pass on offspring. Diet has been implicated in many different important shifts in human evolution. Jean-Jacques already discussed the beginnings of hunting, the consumption of meat eating. I want to talk a bit more today about the inclusion of foods from a savanna environment, the plant foods in particular, looking at tubers and plant underground storage organs. We already discussed a little bit tonight the importance of cooking in human evolution and how that may have caused a fundamental shift in our biology and our behavior. I want to discuss as well how the expansion into new areas with new foods may have had an impact on our history. And then, of course, much more recent times, the invention of agriculture and then the industrialization of our food source may have had fundamental impacts on our bodies. We've already discussed a little bit of how we reconstruct diet in the record. I will review here a little bit. One of the main and most direct ways for reconstructing our diets is to look for the remains of the foods themselves and the tools that were used for processing those foods. We already discussed at some length how animal bones and even shells can be used to understand what kinds of animals, what species, what age of animals were eaten. I, of course, focus a bit more on the plant side of things. There aren't that many easy or obvious ways to recover information about plants. One way is to look for charred plant material, material that has fallen into a fire and carbonized and retained its form. But unfortunately, we don't see a lot of this material prior to, well, first the common use of fire, and second, before the common use of seed plants, so at the origins of sort of the agriculture. The area that I study is microscopic remnants of plants. These are tiny little pieces of plants that have unique morphologies, unique shapes, and you identify these shapes under the microscope, and these microscopic remnants of plants can survive in a variety of archaeological contexts. They survive in the plaque on your teeth, but they can also survive on stone tools. They can survive in protected contexts in archaeological sites. So there are two main types of plant microremains that we look at. The first are phytoliths. These are small silica bodies that the plants produce as a form of mechanical defense. And the second is starch grains, and this is what you consume when you eat any kind of starchy or carbohydrate-rich plant. And as you can see, they vary in size and in shape, and we use these traits to identify them when we find them. Outside of the remains of the foods themselves, we look at the tools that were used to process the foods. So if you find a site with many spear points, for example, you can quite easily infer that the individuals at this site were engaging in hunting. If you find grindstones, you can interpret this to mean that they were processing tough plant foods, either seeds or possibly tubers, underground storage organs, in order to make it more edible. We already touched a little bit on both of these. I think we even saw one of these figures in the last hour. That the shape and the morphology of the masticatory system, of the teeth and of the jaws, can provide a lot of information by inference about the diet of an individual. Now, the morphology of the teeth, these are two primate individuals here on the left. The top one is a primate that consumes almost exclusively leaves, very tough matter that requires scissor-like action in order to break apart this tough leafy material. On the bottom, you have a primate that consumes primarily fruits, some soft, some hard, that needs a big, flat, crushing surface in order to break into those foods. Now, this morphology and biomechanics tells you about the long-term evolutionary pattern of a species. It can tell you what overall an animal is adapted to eat. Dental microwear, on the other hand, tells you about the diet of an individual in the last days to weeks before it died. So these two features of the teeth and jaws give you very different scales of information about the individual's diet. Finally, returning back to the idea of stable isotope analysis, Jean-Jacques already introduced the two main systems that we use, the carbon system and the nitrogen system. The carbon system relies on these two types of plants, the C3 pattern, which includes trees and closed forested environment, herbs and shrubs. And the C4 system is almost exclusively tropical grass. And that there is a strong difference between C3 and C4 producers and consumers at every trophic level. I do need to mention here that in areas of the world where you do not have C4 tropical grasses, this system is still useful for asking questions about diet because it can tell you the difference between a terrestrial animal, a C3 signal, and a signal that comes from consumption of fish or aquatic resources, which tend to look more like the C4 system. The nitrogen system is a little bit simpler. It tells you just about the trophic level, the level on the food chain that an individual was eating at, such that herbivores have a lower nitrogen value than carnivores do. Because aquatic food webs are much longer, many more steps along this aquatic food webs, you can get much higher nitrogen signals in food webs, in aquatic food webs. You've seen this chart already this evening. If you were here for the last talk, I'm sure you saw it many times. This is Bernard Wood's imagination of how our family tree looked like. It shows each of the species that have been identified so far with broad categories of different types of hominins outlined. If we want to ask ourselves what was the diet of these different species, we first need a comparison. We need to know what the diet of the last common ancestor of all of these species was. Unfortunately, we don't have a fossil that we can point to and say this was the last common ancestor. Instead, we make inference by comparing to chimpanzees. Chimpanzees have been fairly well studied. We know that they consume a variety of foods, but they focus fairly heavily on ripe fruits with smaller inclusions of leaves, pith, nuts especially, sometimes insects, and a very small proportion of meat, depending on the season and the place that they live. And we assume, and we have pretty good reasons to assume, that this is very similar to that of the diet of the hominin last common ancestor. However, I want to point out that people who have studied chimpanzee cultures across Africa have discovered that they do in fact have cultures. And by this they mean they use different technologies. They have different ways of accessing food. They access different kinds of foods. In this chart, all of the boxes that are in red and orange are directly food-related behaviors. This is different ways of cracking nuts, or different ways of breaking into termite mounds, or whether or not they crack nuts at all. And what you see is that there is no one single chimpanzee diet. So when you say, what is the diet of last common ancestor? Oh, it's a chimpanzee diet. Well, which one is it? We're not sure. So we have to look for what are the similarities among all of these chimpanzee cultures. And in fact, what we do know is that we know very little about the variability among chimpanzee cultures because most chimpanzee groups are unhabituated, meaning that they're not used to human presence. They run away from researchers. It's very difficult to get as close to chimpanzees as these two individuals here have done. So in fact, one of the projects that my group has been working on is trying to get a better idea of the diet among these unhabituated chimpanzees to see if there is more variability in the diets, in the foods that they eat, than we have previously guessed at or seen. We're doing this by looking at the plant microdomains that are trapped in the dental calculus of these chimpanzees. And what we're finding is that there are strong commonalities, that even though there are these variations among chimpanzee cultures, there are foods that all chimpanzees eat, and they tend to focus, as I said earlier, on ripe fruits, particularly figs and some other varieties of plants that are common in the various habitats that they live. So we have a pretty good idea that our last common ancestor had a diet that included a lot of fruits, probably some leaves, some insects, perhaps nuts, and possibly a very small proportion of meat. We move into a group of species that have been suggested to be early hominins. And by this I mean that they have traits that make them look more closely related to us than to chimpanzees. We know very little about these earliest hominins. There just isn't that much material from any one of these species. What we do see is that they have overall quite thin enamel. This is associated with eating fruits. Again, it's a chimpanzee-like trait. They have a C3 isotope signal, so they are consuming foods from a forested, closed environment. Their hands and arms and legs are all indicating that they climbed a lot, that they spent a lot of time in trees. And all of the proxies that we have, all of the things that indicate what the environment around the individuals that we've recovered was like, suggest that they were living in forested habitats. Overall, this is not that much different from what we would see in a chimpanzee, forest dwellers consuming soft, ripe fruits. We can pretty confidently say that the earliest hominins then were not that much different from what we expect a chimpanzee to be. Moving to more recently, these are two groups of hominins. A first sort of adaptive radiation of hominins. You have a variety of species all living more or less at the same time in more or less the same place. Now something interesting is going on at this time period, in the period between roughly 2.5 to 3.5. I have 2 to 3 indicated here, but the exact dates are somewhat disputed. You see a change in the African environments that these hominins were living in. You go from the environmental proxies suggesting closed forested environments to proxies that suggest the environment was opening out. Grasslands were expanding. It was getting drier. The sites where we find hominins in particular, what we see is that it's moving from the C3 closed forested environment to something more mixed. Not entirely C4, not open savanna completely, but something, an ecotone, a mosaic environment, something that included woodland and grassland. I also want to draw your attention that I've circled 2 different groups here, and what you have are species that we consider to be regular archaic hominins, and then this group off to the right, which we call the megadont archaic hominins. And what do I mean by megadont? I mean that these hominins had massive masticatory systems, that they had very, very large teeth. They had very, very large muscle attachments on their head and on their jaws to be able to produce a lot of force when they bit down. These so-called robust forms, you can see here on the left, look quite different from the so-called gracile forms, as you see on the right. The gracile australopiths are the ones we usually put in the genus Australopithecus. You have in East Africa Australopithecus afarensis and anamensis, and in South Africa Australopithecus africanus. And these all share general similarities in morphology in their masticatory system, including thick enamel. Now, this is a change from the earlier putative hominins, suggesting that they were eating harder or tougher foods, that they needed thicker enamel to resist this. But when you look at the robust australopiths, these are the ones we usually put in the genus Paranthropus. They have even thicker enamel, huge teeth, huge enamel. If you consider that your molar teeth are about the size of your pinky nail, their molar teeth were about the size of your thumbnail. Big, big difference. As Jean-Jacques said earlier, to the point that one of these species was called Nutcracker Man when first discovered. The stable carbon isotopes of these species tell a slightly different story. If you'll notice here, the two robust forms are indicated by the open and the closed circle. One species, the South African Paranthropus robustus, has carbon signal that falls sort of on the more C3 end of things, whereas the Paranthropus boisei in the open circles falls entirely on the right-hand side of the graph. This is a very C4 spectrum. And this is also in contrast to what we see with Australopithecus africanus, indicated here with the open circles, which has a very wide variety of values from far to the left in the very C3 side of things to far to the right in the C4 side of things. Going back to Paranthropus boisei for just a moment, we called him Nutcracker Man. Perhaps that's a misnomer. We need to perhaps think about this individual or the species as grass eater man. And I don't necessarily mean eating the blades of grass, but I do suggest that perhaps he was eating the seeds or the corms, the underground storage organ parts of certain East African grasses, or possibly that he was eating animals that ate those grasses, perhaps termites, perhaps herbivores. All in all, though, given this specialization of certain species and sort of generalist adaptation of other species, I think you're seeing something unusual going on here. You're seeing an adaptive radiation. As discussed earlier, this is also the time period where you see the first evidence for meat eating in the form of cut marks on bones. Now, this was probably not hunting. This was probably not as depicted in the image, in the artist's interpretation here. This was probably scavenging, where hominins were going up to an animal that had been killed by another carnivore and getting the little bits and pieces that they could off of the carcass. Just because at this time period, the hominins were fairly short and fairly small and didn't have advanced technology that would have allowed them to frighten off a quite large predator. However, even though it was not perhaps hunting, this kind of meat acquisition implies new social arrangements among hominin groups, perhaps working together to scare off other carnivores, other predators. But the problem is we don't know which hominin that was, that we have the evidence of the cut mark bones, but there were many species alive in this rough time period, and we can't be sure which one of them was the one who was focusing on meat. So far, most of the studies have been very general about the diets of these individuals, and it's hard to come up with a strict definition of what kind of plants that these individuals were eating. I was lucky enough to be invited to look at the Australopithecus sediba individuals. Sediba is one of the later surviving Australopithecus from about 2 million years ago. And what we found in terms of the plant microfossils in the teeth of these individuals was that they were consuming a wide variety of plants, as indicated by the wide variety of phytoliths. but we saw no evidence of distinctive open grassland grasses. And in contrast, we saw that they were consuming this sort of woody tissues of plants, things like the bark or small stems. We also saw no evidence that they were consuming plant underground storage organs. So this individual, when plotted on the same chart of carbon values that I showed you earlier, falls to the extreme left-hand side of the chart, suggesting that Australopithecus sediba was a closed forest specialist. So it seems to me that what you have at this time period is an adaptive radiation. You have hominin species that are focusing on particular niches in the environment. You have some, like Paranthropus boisei, who seem to be focusing exclusively on open C4 grassland foods. Some, like Sediba, who were working in C3 closed forested environments. Some, like Africanus, who may have been doing a little bit of mixing, maybe more of a generalist view. But you have something like Darwin's finches. You have a variety of species evolving that are focusing on one particular niche. You do also have this expansion out of the forest habitat and evidence of meat eating. But overall, you have this picture that hominins are evolving to a variety of different environments. Moving to Homo erectus. Now, what makes this later species in the genus Homo very interesting is that they were the first species to leave Africa. As you might imagine, leaving Africa presented hominins with very different environments, very different animals, very different plants in particular. So this would have been a variety of new foods that they would never have seen in Africa, and maybe not understand how to interact with. What plants are edible, for example, is not obvious once you leave an area that you're familiar with. We also see a morphological change that Jean-Jacques talked about, in that the gastrointestinal system shrunk quite significantly, and yet the brain size increased quite a lot. And this is indicative of an increase in dietary quality. You have to be able to get more calories from your food without having to spend so much time digesting it. If you don't have a large gut, you can't spend the time to let your gut microbiota digest sort of tough, low-quality plant foods. You need to have improved food somehow. But what is this high-quality, flexible diet? We don't have all that much good direct evidence. We do have evidence that the stone tools that Homo erectus was using were different, somewhat more advanced perhaps, than what had come before. They have developed the hand axe, which may have been a more versatile tool. We do see an increase in cut-marked bones, suggesting that perhaps there was more meat consumption. We see that these hominins lived in mixed habitats, that they had sort of variable C3, C4 isotope signal, and their dental wear is somewhat inconclusive. It's somewhat more variable. There are, however, several theories for what this high-quality, flexible diet. Jean-Jacques already discussed the idea that perhaps it was more meat. Perhaps it was cooking, though the evidence for fire is somewhat scanty at this time period. Some have suggested that it was the consumption of tubers or plant underground storage organs that may have provided a rich carbohydrate that would have been a rich source of food. And again, as Jean-Jacques mentioned earlier, it may have been the consumption of aquatic foods. But again, there's, I think, one site where we have evidence of that. I have been interested particularly in the idea that cooking was important at this time period, and particularly not just cooking meat, but cooking these tubers. This is part of Richard Wrangham's theory that cooking was so vital because it provided more calories. Cooking reduces the bacterial load. It makes proteins and carbohydrates easier to digest. So what my group has done is we've gone to Tanzania and collected some wild East African tubers that are still consumed today by the Hadza hunter-gatherers. We brought them back to Leipzig, where we cooked them in the same manner that the Hadzas do. And we tested these raw and cooked tubers in a mechanical model of the human gut. Now this machine is called the TIM. It's meant to be a replicate of your small intestine, and you put the food in and you measure the amount of glucose or carbohydrates that come out. And here in the chart in the bottom, you can see 2 species of tuber, raw on the left side, cooked on the right. And the species number 1, when you cook it, you actually get less glucose out of it. Species number 2, when you cook it, you get more glucose out of it. So there's a lot of variation here. There's no single benefit to cooking, at least in terms of glucose availability. And we also noted, it's not shown here, that there's a lot of variability within species. So if you take several tubers from the same plant and cook them, one tuber might be better cooked and one tuber might be worse. That's the problem with wild plant foods, is that unlike our domesticated foods, they tend to be highly variable. So cooking may have been extremely important at this time period, but not necessarily for increasing the caloric value of the foods that, that individuals were eating. So at this time period, in summary, we have evidence for dietary flexibility. We know that they were leaving Africa and had to be exposed to new foods. We think that there may have been cooking, perhaps more meat eating, but this is with a question mark after it. Looking even more recently in time, everybody's sort of interested about the Neanderthals. They were sort of our closest cousins, and they lived in areas that we are familiar with. So what happened to them? We all want to know why the Neanderthals went extinct. Well, one explanation that has been put forward is that Neanderthals went extinct because they had a different diet from the early modern humans that replaced them. Based on isotope studies and looking at the fauna associated with the Neanderthals and early modern humans, as well as on the stone tools that they used, several researchers had put a pretty coherent argument together that Neanderthals tended to consume large-bodied terrestrial animals. And showing here in the chart in the middle their carbon and nitrogen isotope values, you can see that their carbon values are falling on low on the C3 side of the chart. Neanderthals, again, are indicated by the open squares. Their nitrogen values vary, but they're quite elevated, up around 12 per mil. Up around 12. Early modern humans, in contrast, had much broader diets that included fish, aquatic resources, birds and small game, and probably also plants. And as you see on this chart, even though early modern humans have higher nitrogen values on Neanderthals, they also have higher carbon values, suggesting that they're making use of aquatic foods in general. They're fishing, they're having shellfish. So they have perhaps a broader diet. When Neanderthals and modern humans interacted, modern humans were then able to get more food from the same area of land because they consumed a wider variety of resources and could therefore outcompete the Neanderthals. This was a very nice closed explanation, a very nice theory, but it occurred to me that none of the methods that have been used here actually tell you very much about the plant foods that these individuals were consuming. Is it true that modern humans ate plants and Neanderthals didn't? So what my group has been doing is looking at the dental calculus of Neanderthals and modern humans, and what we've found is that both groups consumed a wide variety of plant foods, including grass seeds, which was somewhat unusual. People thought that cereals and grains were not really consumed prior to the Neolithic. They also ate tubers, possibly from water lilies, as well as a variety of leafy green plant foods. And in fact, if you compare the number of different kinds of plants that modern humans and Neanderthals consumed, even though the averages of these two groups are not statistically different, there seems to be a pattern that in fact Neanderthals consumed more kinds of plants than modern humans do. These results have been supported by results from dental microware studies that suggest that dental microware, and therefore the foods that the individuals were eating, varies by habitat and not by species. So that groups that fall into the steppe coniferous forest area here in blue all shared a similar microwear pattern, and that was different from groups in the sort of orange Mediterranean evergreen environment, even though both groups include both Neanderthals and modern humans. So at this time period, we can say that hominins had broad diets, plants, animals, that were adapted to the habitat in which they lived. This makes sense. You expect that hominins maybe weren't all eating the same things across the board wherever they lived. And last, to talk about our species, Homo sapiens. Everybody wants to know what we ate. Okay, well, what we ate when is my first response to that. Since the split between hominins and chimpanzees, we've gone through a lot of different population bottlenecks. You have time periods where there were quite a lot of humans or hominins walking around in the landscape, and time periods like 20 to 40,000 years ago when there were very few of us walking around in the landscape. Now this is at the time period where it was Homo sapiens, but our population sizes were very small. This suggests that we were not doing so well. Perhaps we were not eating the right foods. This is also the time period where you see the invention of a whole suite of new characteristics that is commonly referred to as modern human behavior. And I propose to you that perhaps this suite of modern human behavior characteristics was a response to whatever environmental or other factor was causing this steep reduction in our human population sizes. Modern human behavior usually includes things like ornaments, beads and shells, cave painting, new technology, the invention of composite tools, things like the atlatl, which were used for hunting, harpoons for fishing, other kinds of bone tools, as well as a generalized increase in diet breadth to include even more small game, even more fish, and now marine foods in particular, deep sea fish, seals, perhaps whales. So I suggest that perhaps this diet breadth increase was one of the ways that helped us get out of this population decrease. I also want to suggest that it's not just that a dietary increase to include foods that we control the reproduction of is another way in which we've allowed ourselves to become so successful. This is again a chart of population size and indicating that 2 points in time in which we became very much more in control of the foods that we were consuming were points in time where our populations were able then to expand a lot. We had a surplus of food. We could afford to have more children. We could afford to help those children survive to adulthood and have children of their own. In general, agriculture relies on a consumption of cereals, milk, and meat. Some people have argued, though, that this diet is not necessarily good for us, that a diet focused on cereals, on milk, and on meat is strongly correlated with health problems across the world. This is indicating the prevalence of diabetes in different countries around the world. And people looking at these patterns have argued that this agricultural diet is not what we are so-called evolved to eat. And they propose instead that we adopt what they call a Paleolithic diet that avoids dairy, cereals, beans, potatoes, and a lot of the other staples that most people in the world today live on. I argue that in contrast, we have adapted to this agricultural diet. On the right, you can see a heat map showing you with darker colors the prevalence or the frequency of a gene that allows us to digest milk as adults. In almost every other species, infants produce lactase that allows them to digest their mother's milk, but once they are weaned, they no longer need this gene, and thus, as adults, they cannot digest milk. And in fact, most humans also were not able to digest milk as adults until it became very advantageous to be able to do so, such as during the linear band ceramic culture that was circled here in the dotted line, where They kept cows for milk. They produced milk and milk products, and this was a very high source of calories if you had the ability to digest it. And we see an increase in this gene that allows you to digest milk as an adult in European populations, particularly from this area. So there has been strong adaptation, recent adaptation, to this Neolithic diet. I also would ask, if you argue that we should be eating what we are evolved to eat, I would ask, well, what diet do you mean? As I've discussed today, there are many different diets on our evolutionary tree, everything from a completely raw chimpanzee-like fruit-based diet to something that includes moderate amounts of meat, to something that definitely includes cooking, to something that includes strong focus on sort of the individual habitat in which you live. So back to the question, has our health been compromised by our diet? I would say that it's not necessarily the exact fact of eating cereals, but how we eat those cereals, that perhaps we could be eating more bulgur wheat and fewer Twinkies, that industrialization and processing reduces fiber, it reduces nutrients, it adds a lot of chemicals to our foods. And in fact, if you look at the diets of other great apes, hard to read, it says 2 different gorilla groups, chimpanzee, and then the 4th bar is actually the Hadza foragers that I was discussing earlier, and they have extreme amounts of fiber in their diet. They don't eat all of that fiber. In fact, they spit some of it out, but their fiber content is still even much higher than is recommended by the US Department of Agriculture, which is the very last bar on the right. So perhaps we should be looking to eating foods that have been less processed. But that being said, I also would argue that there is no one single best diet. So to come back to this, I think that we have a variety of lessons to be learned from the diets of our ancestors. And I think that just there is a lot to be said and a lot to learn from what they ate, but that doesn't mean that it's necessarily what we should be eating. With that, I thank you for your attention.